Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Philadelphia International Airport. My name is Atif Saeed. I'm PHL's Chief Executive Officer. Thank you for joining us today for this important reminder about Real ID. The countdown to Real ID implementation is on, and we want to make sure that all travelers are ready to have what they need for a seamless experience. The deadline has been pushed back a few times in the past, so many people may not realize that it is finally here. In about 2 months, May 7, 2025, anyone flying domestically will need a Real ID compliant state ID or driver's license or a passport or passport card. If you need Real ID, the time to start the process to obtain is now to beat the last-minute rush. We are grateful to Secretary Carroll and the Department of Transportation, which is offering extended hours at its driver's license centers. We're also proud to enjoy a strong partnership with TSA here at Philadelphia International Airport and appreciate their support along with community partners such as AAA. In a few moments, you will hear from TSA Federal Security Director for Pennsylvania and Delaware, Jerry Sparrow, Pennsylvania Secretary of Transportation, Michael Carroll, and AAA Mid-Atlantic Manager of Public and Government Affairs, Jan Tidwell, who will offer guidance so that our passengers will know how to obtain what they need and when they arrive at PHL starting May 7th.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming today. My name is Gerardo Spiro. I am the Federal Security Director for TSA Pennsylvania and Delaware. And I'd like to thank my partners at Philadelphia International Airport, PennDOT, and AAA for being here with me as we talk about this important subject today. So let's start with a little bit of history. If you remember, on September 11th, 2001, 19 terrorists boarded 4 flights, 1 from Dulles, 1 from Newark, and 2 out of Boston. Those airplanes were taken over, and it resulted in the loss of more than 3,000 lives. Every one of those terrorists used fraudulent IDs when they booked their flights. So in a nutshell, when you use your driver's license that meets Real ID standards, it's proof that you are who you say you are. So secure driver's licenses and identification are a vital component for our nation's security framework. DHS TSA is committed to enforcing the Real ID Act. Therefore, beginning May 7th, 2025, anyone 18 years or older who plans to fly domestically or visit certain federal facilities will need a Real ID or another acceptable form of identification. The Real ID Act prevents federal agencies, including TSA, from accepting driver's licenses or ID cards that do not meet the standards. And I will show you that, if I can get it out of my pocket, I too have a Real ID. So, to receive a Real ID compliant driver's license, applicants must go to a PennDOT office and provide several documents, those with your full legal name, date of birth, social security number, and 2 proofs of address of principal residence, as well as your lawful status. And then PennDOT will verify the authenticity of those documents, and they'll take your photo. So again, Real ID enforcement is going to begin on May 7th. TSA has published a final rule that allows TSA to phase in enforcement of the Real ID requirements. We don't yet have details on what that phase-in might look like, but I can tell you that TSA is committed to facilitate a smooth transition to a Real ID, again, beginning on May 7th. Why? Why do we want to make sure that we have a smooth implementation? Well, imagine a scenario. TSA screens around 2.5 million travelers per day. Imagine a scenario where on May 7th, we suddenly have hundreds or thousands of folks show up at our checkpoints all across the Commonwealth that don't have a Real ID. Can you imagine what that might look like? So what's important is that travelers know that without a Real ID compliant ID or another acceptable form of ID, it is going to significantly impact their travel. Now remember, a driver's license isn't the only form of Real ID acceptable. There are others, such as a passport, a global entry card, and some others. And you can look at TSA's website to get all of the details. So to repeat what Mr. Saeed said, we encourage everyone to go out and get a real ID now. Don't wait. I just renewed mine. It was a very easy process. The intent is to ensure the reliability and accuracy for the identification and try to prohibit people who would seek to defraud the system. So again, I would ask everyone to go out and get that real ID, travel safe, and thank you for your time. And now I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Mike Carroll from PennDOT. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. There are folks that will watch this on the news tonight or tomorrow, and those are folks that this message is directed to. A lot of folks procrastinate. A lot of folks have come to the conclusion they never fly and they don't need to get the real ID. I'm here to tell you that the day will come, maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next week, but somewhere in the future where they have to fly. And absent the real ID, when they show up at the Philadelphia airport or any other airport across this country, it's going to be ugly. They're going to be told that they can't board the commercial flight because they don't have a real ID. Now is the time to solve that. I know there's some hassle here with respect to getting the real ID, but it's not nearly as bad as you think. The PennDOT folks across our state and here in southeastern Pennsylvania are ready to work with folks and deliver them the real ID that they will need so that when the day comes and they have to fly to Phoenix or Salt Lake City, they will have no problem boarding the commercial flight. PennDOT and our partners across the state have been working really hard to get the message out to folks to get the real ID, and especially folks that don't have a passport, because the folks that don't have a passport and don't have a real ID are the group that I'm most concerned about. So please, if you don't have a real ID and you don't have a passport, now is the time. It's really not as complicated as you might think. And our driver's license center and our professionals across the state are ready to work with you. You should visit the PennDOT website to make sure you have an understanding of the documents that you need to bring with you. And then you can walk out in certain cases at certain centers with a real ID or it'll be mailed to you. But please know, even if you think you're never going to fly, the likelihood is somewhere in the future you will. And you probably won't have enough time to go get the real ID if something happens in your family or personal life that demands that you fly somewhere in the United States. Now is the time. We all, the folks that work at the airport and TSA and our partners, AAA and the rest, they don't want somebody to have a horrible experience at an airport and have frustration and aggravation. That can be solved, and now is the time to end the procrastination, take the half an hour or 45 minutes, go get the real ID, and this way, when the time comes, you'll be able to board that commercial flight. Thank you so much for the opportunity, and I'll turn it over now to Jenna from AAA to share her perspective. Jenna.
Thank you, Secretary. Like our partners here today, AAA wants to help get the word out about Real ID as federal enforcement begins on May 7th of this year. Meaning domestic air travel is going to change just in time for the busy summer travel season. Beginning May 7th, Pennsylvania residents will need a Real ID compliant driver's license, photo ID card, or another form of federally acceptable identification, as you've heard here today, such as a valid U.S. passport or U.S. passport card, to board a domestic commercial flight. Real ID is optional in Pennsylvania, but again, as you've heard here today, you may not think you're ever going to fly, but as we say about so many things, it's always better to have it and not need it, as opposed to needing a Real ID and not having it. Things happen, circumstances change, there are emergencies. And what we want to avoid is last-minute scrambling, travel delays, or trip postponements because people don't have what they need. We're just 64 days away from May 7th. Summer is synonymous with travel, vacations, family reunions, destination weddings, and so much more. Air travel has set records year after year post-pandemic. Last year, airline industry experts expected carriers to transport more than 270 million passengers during the summer travel season on more than 26,000 flights per day. If this is any indication of what we expect to see this coming summer, there are a lot of people who need to take the time now, check their identification. Do you have a real ID? Do you have a valid passport? Because you will need one or the other to board a domestic flight. It is the responsibility of the air traveler to have the proper identification. Once enforcement begins, it's not the airline's responsibility to rebook your flight if you can't get on that flight because you don't have the right identification. So there are 64 days, as you've heard from everyone today. Take the time now. It is easier than you think. I also have the Real ID and have renewed again my driver's license with the Real ID. It is an easy and simple and seamless process. And if you like traveling to Disney, traveling to Vegas, traveling to the Bay Area with your driver's license as the identification you use instead of carrying your passport, now is the time. No one wants to see anyone's summer travel plans ruined. TSA's website has additional information, as does PennDOT's website. Thank you.
Well, folks, the Real ID deadline will be here before we know it. Thank you to our partners for coming out to PHL today to help our passengers learn how to get Real ID ready by May 7th. If there are any Real ID related questions, our speakers will be available to take them now.
I have two questions. One is, the first time somebody applies for the Real ID, do they need to go in physically in person, or they reapply online with their regular license and say, I want a Real ID this time?
No, they have to show up at the driver license center with the documentation. It's slightly different for men and women. The short answer is that whenever there's a name change, documentation to note the name change is the important piece of the puzzle. But they have to show up in person. And PennDOT does have extended hours, all available on our website, in an effort to try and meet the need to help folks get the Real ID.
And my second question is, it was being said that the Real ID is going to keep people from being able to forge an ID. How is the Real ID unforgeable?
It's a heightened level of security. I'm not going to stand here and say that it's foolproof, but the documentation you need to prove your identity is the heightened factor that makes it more real than the current Pennsylvania driver's license. So, and that's the case for all 50 states, not just Pennsylvania. So the Real ID is a heightened level of scrutiny to make sure that the person in the photo is the person that they say they are.
Mr. Secretary, in the universe of Pennsylvania driver's licenses, how many are Real ID? Is it most? Is it a few? How many?
About 25% of Pennsylvania drivers have the Real ID at this point.
How much licenses give this right off the bat instead of making this whole new?
I'm sorry to catch the beginning of your question.
Why didn't you make this just off the bat with everybody's license instead of having this whole new layer of government?
Well, the requirement was a federal requirement, so it was a federal law that was passed, and the 50 states were forced to comply with that Real ID requirement. And then the states were given the choice of doing a mandatory Real ID or an optional Real ID, and Pennsylvania was optional. So for folks that chose not to get the Real ID, they didn't have to do anything. But the risk that they take is they won't be able to board a commercial flight on May 7th.
What's the cost?
Well, depending on what the kind of license they have, whether it's a commercial license or they have other endorsements. So about $30.
We're talking about the entire country. I personally live in New Jersey. Is it as simple as walking into a location and just saying, I prefer the real ID, or how does that, you know, when you walk in, what's the process? I mean, from soup to nuts, kind of.
So I'll speak to Pennsylvania. I'm not quite familiar with New Jersey, but I suspect it's similar, and that is you bring the documentation necessary to prove your identity. Again, name changes require additional documentation, you know, marriage, proof of divorce, and so on. So and proof of residence. And so, and for Pennsylvania's drivers that are newer drivers, they already have the real ID. So this message is directed to folks my age and older, primarily, because a lot of those folks have not taken the step to go get the real ID because I'm fearful some of them have made the determination that they're never going to fly and therefore they don't need it. And that's the concern.
Just to follow up on that, I'm so sorry. To follow up on that, though, I guess when you walk into the Pennsylvania DMV, do you have to select between the two? And why would it not just be kind of like, from this point on, we're going to do real ID?
So Pennsylvania's law is an optional, so the driver has the choice. And when somebody has a Pennsylvania driver's license and they're renewing, they generally don't have to go to the driver license center. They can renew online or by mail, and they only show up at the driver's center to get their photo taken. So you show up at the driver's center to get the real ID with the documentation that you need. So when you show up at the driver's center, there are a lot of different things that can happen at a driver license center, but you would be directed to a real ID counter to try and expedite that process. And so you're treated in a way that you hopefully walk out with the real ID provided you have the right documentation.
I got a couple for you here. You say it's from just regular, non-commercial, it's $30. You walk in there with a check or money order for $30, and you show your birth certificate, you show your utility bill, and you show or your old driver's license, and you will get that. Am I correct on that?
No, depending on whether there were name changes, if for women primarily, if there's a marriage or a divorce or some circumstance like that, you'd have to bring proof of the name change as well. But instead of trying to recite the documents necessary, the PennDOT website has the list of the documents that you would need to bring with you. And so I think the smart thing to do is for folks to take a look at the website and then determine what they need to bring with them.
What about somebody has a common law marriage where there was no, nothing official done, but you've taken the last name of somebody?
Yeah, I'm not going to speak to common law marriage. I'm not sure we have common law marriage in Pennsylvania. If there's been a name change, you have to bring the documentation relative to the name change.
After May 7th, is there going to be some grace period, or May 7th will be strictly enforced?
So I'll let the TSA take that one.
Yeah, thank you. So as I mentioned, thank you for the question. As I mentioned in my comments, there is going to be a phased-in approach. We have yet to know exactly what that phased-in approach is. We do, however, have other tools and methods at our disposal to identify travelers.
9/11 happened 20-some years ago, and we've been flying unsafe for the last 27 years. Why is this needed?
It was a recommendation of the 9/11 Commission, and no, we have not been flying unsafe for the last 20 years. It's long overdue, in my opinion. I can't comment on why it hasn't happened thus far.
Will this be expanded to rail traffic as well, or to other main traffic?
I'm not aware of anything beyond aviation at the moment.
All right, thank you. They're all going to be sticking around to do one-on-ones. Thank you.